Hey gang, this week's episode is brought to you by oldschoolshirts.com. Hey, check them out. You like defunct teams and leagues and t-shirt form? Well, you'll find them there, but a whole bunch of other stuff too. Do you remember a radio station of the past or perhaps a mall that you used to go to? All kinds of great cultural and sports memories can be found at the great folks at oldschoolshirts.com. Promo code GOODSEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. And now, here's our show.
Back in the 70s, if you wanted to watch sports, there was not a lot available.
My father and I knew that there was a nation of sports junkies.
We think we have an idea that's going to change the world.
More sports on the air for the community.
Bill would inspire you to come along.
Somebody said, if you're serious about this, you ought to find out about satellite.
What do we know about satellite? Telstar, Sputnik, satellite? What do you mean satellite?
There's 8,760 hours in a year. We're like, what are we going to put on this?
Of course, we don't have any idea where the money's coming from.
There was a whole lot of chutzpah and a whole lot of vision, and they're maxed out on their credit cards. It's the American dream.
It's a fairy tale. We're going to go on the air at 7 o'clock, come hell or high water.
You guys ready for this?
What you'll see may convince you you've gone to sports heaven.
Welcome, everyone, to the ESPN Sports Center.
When somebody tells you you can't do something, you kind of want to prove them wrong.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Well, hello. How are you, everybody? My name is Tim Hanlon, and you are in the right place. It's Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. Thank you for finding us. We appreciate it. Hope your Easter and Passover and spring went and or are going well. And we appreciate you pulling up a chair, having a seat, and enjoying the festivities this week. And it is timely because this evening, as we drop this episode on April the 6th, this coming evening, on April 6th evening at 8:30 Eastern Time, p.m. on ESPN, you will be able to enjoy, as I did in advance form, the topic of our conversation this week. It is the documentary film called Sports Heaven, The Birth of ESPN. Yes. And we're here with two gentlemen very instrumental in the development and putting together of this wonderful documentary. Highly recommended. Get your DVRs ready to record it again as we drop this episode on Monday, the 6th of April, 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time on ESPN. Sports Heaven is the name of it. And Greg DeHart and Mike Soltys are here. Greg DeHart is the producer, actually the director. Let's get these functions correct. Is the director, has done a lot of other documentaries in the past, including sports ones, by the way, including a really cool one back in 2022 about how could you best describe him? The Clown Prince of Baseball, Max Patkin. Great film. Maybe we'll talk to Greg on another episode about that and the story of him. A former minor league baseball pitcher, by the way. So Greg kind of knows a lot about sports just from the inside, as well as how to put all the pieces together in a compelling narrative television / film kind of manner. And he is joined in our conversation with Mike Soltys, who is a long time, I think it's almost 40 years now, if I'm not mistaken, public relations, corp communications guy at ESPN. Was there not exactly at the beginning, but certainly near it. I think it was around 1980 or so, coming out of UConn, finagling his way into an internship that didn't really even exist yet at the then fledgling ESPN, and is now actually his official title there now is the ESPN historian. And that comes in handy because the topic of this film is the very early days, the birth of this amazing network we know as ESPN. It's been going on for decades now, and it's just been part of, at least a few generations now of people's sports understanding here in the United States and frankly, worldwide. But as you'll hear in our conversation, the most modest of beginnings and then some to be discussed. People like, in particular, Bill Rasmussen and his son, Scott Rasmussen, probably the most essential key figures in the birthing of this network. Entrepreneurs, both of them, in particular, the father, Bill. If you're not familiar with the origin story of this network, buckle up, because you're going to enjoy the various tidbits that we go through. There's certainly not enough time to go through all of them. And the documentary fills in a lot of stuff. And frankly, even if you consider yourself an aficionado of ESPN, or an expert, if you will, from years and years of watching, you will be amazed at some of the things that you did not know. As I found, there were at least a few Easter eggs in this story. If you think you know the story of the beginnings of this network, ESPN, you owe it to yourself to watch this documentary this evening as we drop this episode, as well as there will be a book coming out as well. The book is not yet available. We'll keep you updated as to when that happens. We think that's going to be in May sometime. But the audio book is actually available starting tomorrow on the, I think it's 7th of April. That's tomorrow as we drop this episode. It is also called Sports Heaven, The Birth of ESPN. You'll be able to find it and get it in audiobook fashion, as well as eventually the book from our friends at Amazon. We'll have a couple of links in the show description this week, as well as on the website, and we'll layer in the book link when it becomes available. But you can get this audiobook version, which is kind of really more than just that, because you're going to hear in the audiobook the words and the actual interviews, a lot of them, maybe with some extra stuff that is not actually in the film too. So a couple of ways, at least now, and a book form to come about the story of this amazing phenomenon in American culture. And it is called, again, Sports Heaven, The Birth of ESPN. Again, the film drops this evening at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time on ESPN. We are not sure, as we record this episode, if and when it might repeat somewhere along the ESPN networks out there, or on the app, that kind of stuff. But somehow, if you're listening to this after the show, after the show debuts, you can go to the production house's website. That's Tenero, T-E-N as in Nancy, E-R-O, Tenero.tv. That is the production house that owns the rights to this film, and that will be the place to find out where this film might be as you might be stumbling into this episode. All right, so let's not waste any more time. Let's get into this episode. Here's my conversation we had just a few days back with Mike Soltys and Greg DeHart as we talk about this amazing documentary film. It is called, again, ESPN Sports Heaven, The Birth of ESPN. And please, as always, enjoy. How about a little background about each of you? And then I want to kind of figure out a way to tell how this idea of the doc came together, how you came together, so to speak, and organically, the genesis of the idea and all of that. And Mike, I think your stuff is a little bit more obvious than Greg's, but just have at it, guys.
Go ahead, Mike.
Sure. I had the good fortune of meeting Bill Rasmussen, the founder of ESPN. I was a senior at UConn in the summer of 1980. And my dad was the SID at UConn and had known Bill for 15 years, and we just happened to run into him. UConn became a big part of the launch of ESPN, so he was in stores a lot, Bill. And as Bill tells to this day, I said the magic words, which are, I will work for free. And I started to drive from stores to Bristol, and it's 2026, and I'm still talking to you from Bristol. So
in essence, an internship thing that didn't even exist, probably, that you talked your way into to kind of go.
Correct. Yeah, it did not exist. And Bill loved the idea of somebody working for nothing, connected me with at that point, the head of PR, Rosa Gaddy. And she liked the idea of having, there wasn't a whole lot of people working at ESPN. She loved the idea that she could have somebody for free. And I started driving down from stores to Bristol to work.
And in ESPN, though, you want to quickly describe your little career path there, because you're still there in many ways, shapes, and forms. But what did you kind of start doing, and then what have you kind of evolved into now?
Yeah, I started the internship in PR and stayed in PR for 40 years plus, and that dealt with publicizing the network early on, which was a hard sell to some people. And then over time, as ESPN got big, it was a lot of issue management and dealing with controversies that came up. And in the last year and a half, I'm part-time here as the company historian. I lived through almost all of it. The very early part I didn't live through. I spent a lot of time researching along with Greg for this book and documentary. And we're able to dig deep into the 1978, 79 part of the history, which I wasn't as familiar. But now I'm a part-time historian for ESPN.
Greg, your background's more from actually producing things like this. How do you come into all of this and the ESPN diaspora?
Yeah, so I have, several, almost 3 decades now, I think, of making documentary films. And, I had been doing a couple of documentary films with our executive producer, Garrett Sutton. And Garrett happens to be good friends with Bill Rasmussen, one of the founders of ESPN. And it just so happened the timing came about when we had finished one film. Garrett Sutton had been talking to Bill about doing a film based upon one of his books and asked me if I wanted to do it. And I said yes. I jumped at the opportunity, being a long time, almost lifetime ESPN viewer. It's kind of, one of those great films that don't come around very often to dig into. And being a huge sports fan myself and actually ex-athlete, I played minor league baseball for 5 years. It was right up in my ballywick, and jumped at the opportunity. And here we are about 14 months later with the finished film, which is how much time it took Bill and Scott to put ESPN together from the time they came up with the idea until it actually launched. So we better get hopping a little bit faster, Mike, on the next one.
Yes.
We're going to be put to shame again by Bill and Scott.
Probably not as much mud though as the original though, but they impress. Okay, so how does this come to play, right? Because it took me about halfway through this documentary. I'm not going to try to give away too much, right? But a lot of it is a story, and some of these pieces of the story have been done or at least out there, at least to fans who have been paying attention. But how does this? I mean, it took me a while to sort of figure out that this was largely the thread that put this story, the way you guys put it together, was that of the life and times and the innovation and the curiosity and the just the sheer doggedness of one Bill Rasmussen, right? Is this his idea? Is this ESPN's idea? Is this a bunch of people there, especially those, if you will, lifers or people there for a long period of time, some of whom were interviewed during the course of this thing, to, not to put words in your mouth, perhaps right the wrong, if you will, or dispel the mythology and or correct the record, so to speak, about how foundational this guy was in bringing ESPN to life?
I'll start, Mike. I would say no. I mean, there was no agenda going in at all, other than to tell the truth and to tell it in an interesting way. So no one said you have to do this, you have to, right some wrongs. There over the years, Bill has kind of gone within the I guess he's been liked at ESPN at times and been shunned at times, depending on which president was there at the time. So that, we didn't cover, well, we did cover that. That's not true. So, we covered his story. And I think what was different about this one from the research I had done in the past is that Scott is playing a prominent role here too. He's finally getting his due. I mean, it's, Bill was certainly the driving force, but his son Scott was there the whole way too. So there was no agenda going into it. It would, other than to make tell a story in an entertaining way that was honest.
And the way ESPN got involved was that Bill went to Jimmy Pitaro, the current chairman, who is a lover of ESPN history and has a great relationship with Bill. And Bill went to him and said, "I'm working with Greg and Garrett on this film, but it's clear we need some ESPN cooperation." in order to make it work. And that wasn't from an editorial end, that was from access to video of the early days. It was to early, press releases and press clips. It was to open the door to interview possibilities. And Jimmy said he was all for it, liked the idea. And that's how I ended up getting asked if I would serve as a producer on the film, but on behalf of ESPN. I work for ESPN, not for Greg and Garrett.
Yeah, and I guess that's kind of where I was sort of getting at, right? Because I think in many ways that this wasn't commissioned, quote unquote, by ESPN,
right,
say, to like celebrate a particular anniversary.
Yeah, no, it wasn't at all.
I think that's kind of important because I think what that does is it adds objective credibility, shall we, or unflinchingness.
Yeah, and when I got connected with Greg, I mean, I'd never met him or knew him at all, and I was enthused right from the beginning that his strongest desire was to tell a truthful story, and the truthful story would be what he learned reading these things. Bill kept a diary back in 78 and 79, and then what the people that we interviewed, and we interviewed all the key people that are still alive, what they told him. And that was the basis of the story. There wasn't, Scott expressed reluctance to Greg, in terms of, is ESPN going to want to tell his truthful story, which includes that, he felt that it was soul crushing how Getty Oil treated him. But Greg was able to assure him that ESPN just wanted a good story that was accurate about our launch.
And Tim, I'll just follow up on that. There wasn't one time where anyone at ESPN came and questioned what we were doing. It was complete 100% autonomy. So it was Mike and I in the trenches the entire time, and we kept it just kind of really tight, the two of us. And Mike was certainly, it doesn't happen without Mike because of all of his knowledge there, and he knows where everything is. He knows all the players. And, one of the things that he did, which was critical, was to contact all of these people, the interviewees, who all had, were very comfortable with Mike. So those doors were always easily opened, which isn't the case all the time. So it was really a perfect combination. Mike has got his own thing going over there, and we just kind of quietly went about our business and produced a film.
And with a little bit of input from Bill and from Garrett, we came up with a list of about 30 people we wanted to interview, and Greg interviewed the first 22 on the list and said, we pretty much have everything, and there's nobody that turned us down. So they wanted to tell the story, and they appreciated the fact as soon as they knew that I was involved and talked to Greg and heard his outlook, that they were going to be comfortable telling their story. Because some of these people did not do a whole lot of interviews over the years because they just were worried that the correct version of the story wasn't going to be told.
Yeah, and there are some pleasant surprises there along the way of some faces and some voices that have been out of the spotlight for a few or a lot of years. That fans and fanatics, if you will, of the network will happily be will love to see and hear from. But so, okay, we'll nibble around some of the aspects of the story itself, and we will try not to, quote unquote, give away too much, right? Because there's some interesting twists and turns. I learned a few things, and I thought I knew quite a bit. But I'm really interested in some of the process, shall we say. You're sort of hinting at some of the people that you went to or reached out to interview and stuff. But take us into a little bit about how you try to get some of the nuts and bolts sort of in a framework so that you can move forward and start exploring and or getting stuff, right? I'm talking about assets. I'm talking about the interviews, like where, when, how, that kind of stuff. Because I think people on the outside kind of don't really kind of understand just how complex a task a true documentary is, because it is kind of a synthesis of lots of different pieces of information. And I got to think, even on a personal level, given your both of your individual connections to the network or passion for it, just rife with rabbit holes of information and YouTube clips and stuff that may just detract you from doing your job, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of information out there. It's like any other project. You just you get in as much information that's out there. Fortunately, our primary research is one of Bill's books. So you start with that, and then you kind of get as much as you can and start comparing those different versions to Bill's version. Start talking to people and get second opinions, and you start to, the truth starts to slowly come out. And once I've done, at that point, I put it into kind of a very simple outline. And, I see kind of how this is going to go. I mean, basically at its heart, it's an entrepreneur story. And, that doesn't sound that exciting as, an entrepreneur story. It sounds like a business class, So how do you make that exciting? And fortunately, with Mike's work in the archive, and he can talk more about the archive, he was able to pull out everything that they had from the launch day. And, it was very obvious from the beginning that everybody talked about that launch day and how they barely made it to air on the date and time that Bill and Scott had set. That is where the movement was in that one day. And so using that one day, kind of starting in the morning, and I woke up in the morning and here we go, it's game time until now it's over, let's pop some champagne. There's a lot of energy in there. There's a lot of movement in there. So using that as the framework and then jumping out of that occasionally and telling Bill and Scott's backstory, which on paper can seem dry. And putting those two together, I think is what gives it its movement. So, that was an important decision that was made early on as far as the story. And, one thing is to like, hey, I want to tell this story. And then the other thing is because it's a visual medium, we need coverage, right? So we need photos and video and all of that. And that's where Mike came in and just found us everything that we needed in a very unorganized ESPN archive.
Yeah, the challenge was a couple of things. I mean, 1979, you don't have employees running around with cameras and camcorders and things. So none of that really existed, though we chased some leads of people saying, oh, this person or that person took a lot of pictures. And then they'd share the pictures and it had the current logo from ESPN, which started in like 1984, so that wasn't real. Or we got a lot of softball playing. Apparently ESPN people played a lot of softball in 1979 and 80, and those pictures don't exactly lend themselves to a documentary. But the other challenge was that in order to save money in 1979, tapes were recorded over unless there was a scheduled re-air. So the famous Dick Vitale first game video, which ESPN's aired 1 million times, it exists because that game was then getting repeated a few times. A SportsCenter wasn't. So we don't have footage of Chris Berman on SportsCenter in 1979, though he was on all the time, but they recorded over them. But fortunately, a guy named Ken Boudreau, who's interviewed in the movie, was in charge of the videotape library for many years, and he made sure anything from September 7, 1979 was preserved.
If you're a fan, what you'll see in the next minutes, hours, and days to follow may convince you you've gone to sports heaven. Beyond that blue horizon is a limitless world of sports, and right now you're standing on the edge of tomorrow. Sports, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with ESPN, the Total Sports Cable Network. Yea, verily, a sampler of wonders. Hi, I'm Lee Leonard, welcoming you to Bristol, Connecticut, 110 miles from New York City. Why Bristol? because here in Bristol is where all the sports action is as of right now. And we're just minutes away from the first event on the ESPN schedule. That's the 1979 NCAA College Football Preview. And then we're going to follow that with a doubleheader of games. 2 of the Professional Slow Pitch League World Series games will be seen tonight. Now, softball is one of those rare sports that everybody knows something about. Why? Because we all play it on Sunday when we drink a little beer. Now, here's another innovation on ESPN, and it's going to be a big part of our future. The Sports Center with George Grand. He'll have the latest on what's happening all around. George?
Thanks, Lee, and welcome everyone to the ESPN Sports Center. From this very desk in the coming weeks and months, we'll be filling you in on the pulse of sporting activity, not only around the country, but around the world as well. If it takes an interview, we'll do it. If it takes play-by-play, we'll do it. If it takes commentary, we'll do that too. That's the way we'll function from the ESPN Sports Center, and we'll be filling you in on further updates as the broadcast progresses.
And then we were doing this, and somebody that currently works in the tape library, a guy named Joe Wendlings, called me one day and said, "Have you ever watched this rehearsal of the first show?" And I'm like, not only have I not watched it, I never even heard it existed. And that turned to be the best video find that we had. So, and then it was also digging into, press releases and the NCAA contract and press clips and things with the city of Bristol. And, there's a lot of documents and I was involved with it over the years that were preserved here for posterity. And those proved to be very helpful.
One of the things that we were really lucky with too is because it can be a dry subject, entrepreneurs putting together a company. It could be pedantic, right? But Mike was able to, we got some great interview subjects, and thankfully they were at critical times in the story to bring in someone that when Bill and Scott find the satellite, we have the salesperson who sold it to him, Al Parinello, was just great on camera.
Totally.
So
agree.
we got
a total.
Yeah,
for the outsider doesn't sort of understand the nuances of that industry, which is great.
Yeah, and I coincidentally sat next to him at a dinner that was honoring Bill Rasmussen 7 years ago. It was the one interaction with him, but I had his contact information, and I knew he was a big personality. And part of Greg's selection about who to interview is it's a visual medium, and you want people that have some energy and know how to tell a soundbite in a concise way. And we had the good fortune that really hit on everybody.
Were there any sort of magical discoveries or unearthings or golden eggs that were discovered in the research, or a missing piece that all of a sudden was found, or somebody remembered I had to think there were a couple of twists and turns in the pile of stuff that you wanted to put together, from all the visuals out there.
As having done some of this history stuff, I knew some of the fun stories, but backing them up. I mean, there's the legendary that a mayor of Bristol didn't want ESPN to move to Bristol because satellite dishes kill birds. And so that became a fun story angle, but, yet searching out the old newspapers that outlined, that actually happened and what the quote was and everything else. Because, Greg very much wanted it to be accurate. We didn't want it to be a legend of something about dead birds, but sure enough, the research indicates that it was all correct. The other one that I loved is that the model for what became SportsCenter, and it's remarkable, SportsCenter was the first show on ESPN, and here we are in 2026, and SportsCenter is still the centerpiece of ESPN. SportsCenter, Bill Rasmussen did a time buy on a religious over-the-air channel in Hartford, Connecticut, to do a 30-minute show in 1976. And that was the model for what became SportsCenter. It was called Sports Only. And, there's very little on it. Ken Boudreau was in the film, who also then worked at ESPN, worked at Channel 18. And so he was a good source of information. And I found one newspaper clip in the Springfield, Massachusetts paper, because Bill was well known in Springfield, about this show. And the thing I found in that was that that show also began on September 7. And I called, after I found that, I called up Bill and I'm like, are you some weird numerologist that like 9/7 means something to you? And he laughed and had no recollection of the sports only starting on the same date that ESPN started. So it's that kind of fun stuff that as a history guy that I really enjoyed uncovering.
And I will just add that unfortunately we figured that out after the film was done. So it's not in the film. But it's one thing that really stood out for Mike and I. And the other thing, Tim, is Scott's participation, right? I mean, from the very beginning, it's like we can't tell the story without Scott. But it was, I was always discouraged. He's not going to tell the story. He doesn't want it. He's bitter. He doesn't like the way it ended. But fortunately, with knowing that Mike was involved, and I guess he saw that I was going to be honest, he eventually said, okay, let's do it. And the interview with Scott turned out to be like 4 hours, and it was as much probably a therapy session for him as it was, getting sound bites for a film and telling his story. So that was really important too, and we're really proud that he was able to, that he participated in the film.
So let's dig into that for a little bit, because I honestly, one of the reveals at the end of the movie, sorry, I'm going to give this away, but people are going to love to want to see this movie anyway, and that's for this one little piece of information, right? But I didn't realize that Bill, the dad, and Scott, the son, were not only estranged in the wake of all of this stuff, and there are reasons why, because founders and management and owners don't always get along with each other as the years go on. We'll talk about that a little later. But I didn't realize that they were not only estranged, but still estranged to this day. Maybe a little insight into that as to maybe why and how, because we know that Scott left, as is told in the story. But it's also you go to great lengths in the story to talk about the various times that they were together, important periods when they were together in a car, for example. And even a kind of a bonding piece or two. It seems kind of like a surprise or a shock to me that why even think about a reconciliation? I can't imagine. I don't understand why they're so separate, if you will.
I don't either. We don't either. It's the big mystery, and they wanted to remain private. Honestly, Tim, we just don't know. It's all guessing, and we don't guess.
Interesting.
Yeah. And, the other thing, just from a practical standpoint and from, I don't know, you don't want to hear this at the end, is that they were never together in the film. And some of the early people we showed rough cuts to, I'd say half the people that we trust that we show rough cuts to, said, why didn't we ever see them together? So I felt that had to be addressed. It was a touchy thing for, our team also. Should we put this in there? Because it is a bummer at the end. But it's true. So, and I just, I don't know, Mike, did you feel like we should have put that in there?
To the point you made, it does explain what's something that the question gets begged. And we did offer to both that if they wanted to do a reunion for the film, bring them both to Bristol, bring them, Bill's a big baseball guy. So bring Scott and lives in Tampa, bring Scott to one of these, baseball spring training facilities and have a catch with Dad. But they weren't interested in doing it.
Yeah, thematically, as if you're a documentarian, that seems like a logical, at least, thread to pull. Well, that's very interesting, and it was kind of a surprise. But okay, so
yeah, and Tim, I just say I tried with both of them.
Sure.
And neither of them wanted to go there. And then when I was crafting that last card that talks about them being estranged, I would go to Scott and say, how does this verbiage feel? And he would go, well, we might change that. And then I would take that to Bill. I would say, Bill, how does this verbiage sound? And it took us a little while, but we got to, a common, we got to an agreement point, and that's what is finally in the film.
Yeah, that's where I was going, Greg, was on the notion of how aligned were their respective stories, because arguably they were probably the longest, most involved in this entire story, right? So it's probably really important to, if not get agreement on, at least align the stories so that they're in the same room, right?
Correct. Yes. Their stories were, for the most part, aligned. I can't remember any major discrepancies. But, I know that, Scott had never really gotten much more than a mention. So I know he was happy to be able to, really kind of get it out and, here's what the story was. And then once they both saw the film, um, neither of them said, look, that's wrong, or, you got to correct that. So they were, whether they were apart or not, they were in alignment with, if they know it or not, but they were in alignment as far as the facts go too.
Yeah. And we did an employee screening in Bristol earlier this week, and George Grand was kind enough to attend. And, to see, we've been working on this film, but to see it on a bigger screen, and there, Scott sounds and has mannerisms and is very much his father's son. And I said to George afterwards, I said, that was Bill 25 years ago. And George smiled and said, I had the exact same thought.
Very interesting. That must have been an interesting room to see all this play out. All right, a couple of things here. I could go on. I mean, I've got so much stuff here, but I'm going to try to make it worth your time and not bore you to tears. I sort of hinted at it earlier, but it's very clear that this very much aligns with kind of you said the entrepreneurial story. And my day job has been over the years in the media and technology space. I ran ventures practices, founded them even for two major ad agency holding companies where, during the aughts and the teens, we kind of did partnerships and investments in various technologies that might make things in media and marketing and advertising better, stronger, faster, that kind of stuff. Deal with tons of entrepreneurs, right? But clearly going through the dynamic of how those kinds of things get funded and started and incubated and then grow if they're successful or if they're lucky. And then the next stage of which tends to be, and I think Bob Lee in particular kind of put these in the best words in the documentary, you get basically the pieces on the chessboard get a little crowded, right? You get more institutionalization, you get more process. And it's clear to me coming out of this documentary that Bill was sort of the inveterate entrepreneur type, right? And you could easily see once you know the story of Stu Evie, for example, and Getty Oil, or even the arrival of a professional manager in Chet Simmons, right? That both of those guys in their own different ways were never going to kind of align for a long period of time with an entrepreneur who kind of had the idea in the first place and is full of ideas, so to speak.
Yes.
Yeah.
You had Stu Evie, as soon as he took charge, was...
Sorry, to clarify, Stu Evie was the money guy from Getty Oil.
Correct. And in fairness to him, ESPN never happens if Stu Evie doesn't greenlight, millions of dollars spent on ESPN. Bill Rasmussen,
as was said many times in the documentary.
Yeah. So it's like he is the villain in the documentary, but he also is a little bit of the hero because that money was essential. So the story doesn't happen. But he had an ego, and the sports writers of America were very much celebrating Bill and Scott Rasmussen, including Sports Illustrated. And this is the glory days of Sports Illustrated. And Stu was not happy that his name wasn't in these things, and Bill and Scott were. And so there was that ego division that happened. And then he brings in Chet Simmons, who also, isn't appreciative that the attention is going to Bill and Scott. And so and both those gentlemen are now deceased. And so, Greg had to go through pains to make sure their voice. George Connor provided it for Getty. He was the executive that Stu put in Bristol from Getty. He just recently passed away, but the interview happened before that, obviously. And then Chet Simmons, I found an interview that ESPN did with him that never aired from the 20th anniversary in 1999, where Chet talked about the whole experience very candidly and openly for an hour, and we were able to use that. So yeah, that the entrepreneur, Scott was pushed out immediately, and Bill could read the writing on the wall that he didn't have a real long future.
Yeah, and Tim, I would just add that, the genesis of all this, going back to Bill, when he got out of the Air Force, he went to corporate America and worked at Westinghouse, where, the light bulb company. And it wasn't long that he realized he just wasn't made for corporate America. So he quit that to start his own company, which was very successful, and he sold it. And at that point, without any experience, in sports or broadcasting, decided he was going to become a broadcaster, and which, in my opinion, is really, really, really represents who Bill was and his optimism. He answered an ad for a broadcaster at a small little station in Westerly, Connecticut. Rhode Island, Westerly, Rhode Island. I'm still learning the area, by the way, up there.
I even took you to Westerly.
Very embryonic, this New England thing. So, we'll catch
whole New England thing, man. But he goes to this interview and says, the guy asks him that's interviewing him and says, why should I give you this job? And he says, because I can do it. Because I know I can do it. And that's, it's his enthusiasm that convinces this guy to give him a job in broadcasting. Without any experience. So leaving the corporate world and taking his enthusiasm and going into to becoming an entrepreneur and ultimately starting ESPN with Scott. And then the corporate world eats them both up, again. So it's kind of an odd full circle for them. And I think it, justifies Bill's thought that the corporate world wasn't right for him once he got fired from it a year into the deal.
And both continued to do new companies, one together with Enterprise Radio, which was a 24-hour sports radio network, which was ahead of its time. Those didn't exist back at that point. It was right after ESPN. Unfortunately, they didn't have the Getty Oil. They didn't have the Stu Evie to save them financially, and that folded pretty quickly, and they went their own ways. Scott, very successfully in public polling, created Rasmussen Reports and sold that, and that remains a very successful public polling, and now has an incubator with Google tying in AI with public polling. And Bill went on and had all sorts of projects. He was involved with the launch on behalf of the Big Ten of Big Monday on ESPN with the Big East and Big Ten basketball at a time that the Big Ten just wasn't getting the attention it thought it needed, and they hired Bill to do that. So he had all sorts of he came up with smart homes before America was ready for smart homes, and he was ahead of his time on that, and that he couldn't build it to scale. I mean, so he was always very visionary about what's coming next.
I love the fact that you made a mention of Enterprise Sports Radio because for various reasons. One of our previous guests, the great John Sterling, had a cup of coffee for those few months, and there are a bunch of interns that wound up having great broadcast careers that were there and stuff. That in itself could be at least a mini documentary, if you ask me. But it's also very interesting, though, too, right? So what I'm trying to sort of figure out is how much of this, shall we say, separation after the birth of this network, how much of this was Bill and Scott and their unique personalities as entrepreneurs, or was because they were entrepreneurs and they built something, just generally it wasn't going to be long lasting once professional, quote unquote, management and big corporate investment were in the mix, right? Because I would argue that, even the most docile of entrepreneurs, which tends not to be the case anyway, would have a hard time going from building to running and maturing. Because I think it's pretty clear, if you ask me, right, which you're not. I love the fact that you brought one of our previous guests, who's been on the show twice, Howard Baldwin, into the mix in the early narrative story, because although you kind of don't go too deep in it, it's clear that relationship with the Whalers was great and until it wasn't, right? And it was kind of, so it's clear that he has a unique personality. I'm just trying to figure out, and I don't know the man, if it's because he's an inveterate entrepreneur and that's just the way they're wired, or there's some other quirks there.
I'd be guessing. I mean, I'm kind of guessing, but I think that it's not uncommon for entrepreneurs to start companies and the big corporation comes in and pays them some kind of a severance pay and they move along. I think it's less common, as Matt Buckler in the film, who was a sports writer at the time and the one person who attended the original press conference for ESPN. But he says, look, and this is the exception. He says, look, Ted Turner didn't get kicked out of CNN, did he? So, I think that, the vast majority of entrepreneurs who start corporations don't last very long. It's just a clash in personalities and the way you do business. Bill likes to come up with an idea and go after it. And I don't think the corporate world, and intentionally and probably rightfully, doesn't move as fast. So it just wasn't a great marriage.
And the ego, again, I come back to ego. And, we'd heard the stories of how Stu Evey reacted to the Sports Illustrated story. And again, put in context for listeners how big a deal Sports Illustrated was in 1979 and how big a deal that they wrote this very positive story about ESPN that somehow Stu Evey doesn't like. We hit a number of people and said, was his reaction really that, did he really go that much off? And George Connor at Getty, absolutely. Scott, absolutely. Dennis Randall, the PR guy at the time, who moved over with Bill from the Whalers. Yep. It's just like, yeah, that did it. And then the white Cadillacs, which Jim Miller had gotten into in his book about ESPN, like, were these really, and yeah, Chet Simmons' thing was, if this was my son, I would not allow him to have a white Cadillac. I'd tell him to start, in the mailroom. And, those little things that irritated the establishment that Bill and Scott just couldn't put their arms around. But yeah, it's true. There was that kind of reaction to a ESPN vanity plate and a Sports Illustrated story that any objective person would say was a home run.
Yeah, it's like the old, in that kind of scenario and that kind of timing, right? Any publicity is good publicity, right? It's like you're paying, right?
And the story was great. I mean, we reread the story and it's like, wow, this is a, pre-launch ESPN and Sports Illustrated is giving it the stamp of approval. It's like, wow.
Couple of elements I want to kind of dig into before we kind of round up here. I thought you guys did a really excellent job in corralling the dual, maybe tri nature of the business coming together. And it almost feels to me like, and I was flabbergasted to hear that two of these elements, at least it seem to at least be recalled as effectively happening or coming to fruition on the same day. But the three things that I think you had a graphic that maybe had four things in there, but there's the Getty Oil investment. There's the NCAA conversation / content relationship. There's also obviously the satellite component too, right? How that's important, right? Put that on the side because that's more technology than it is. But the Budweiser advertising deal,
Right.
Those three things in my mind, at least, it almost feels to me like if even one of those things doesn't come into the mix at the right time, this thing doesn't launch really.
Right. And Greg correctly called it the juggle in the movie because Bill he's playing each one off the other. You tell the NCAA that Getty's going to come in with money.
Yeah.
And Anheuser-Busch is going to come in with money. And then you tell Anheuser-Busch that, oh, we got this deal with the NCAA and we're going to get distributed with RCA and all these cable systems. And he just did that, playing one off the other. And they all were coming to fruition at the same time that he was running out of his venture capital money.
Yeah, I mean, look, that's classic move, right? I mean, we've had plenty of, so we've talked to the late great Dennis Murphy, for example, who founder of multitude of leagues, including the American Basketball Association. Mm-hmm. And before, we were lucky to talk to him about a couple of years before he passed away, but he vividly remembers basically doing that hustle, right? As did Gary Davidson of the World Football League, right? It's like franchise first, details later, right? And this guy's doing that. Why aren't you doing that? And Howard Baldwin verified all of that stuff, right? It's just the way it was done, and I don't think half of it would pass today. Maybe it would. I don't know.
Yeah, and let's not forget a real critical component in there, which is when J.B. Doherty, a venture capitalist, came in too during this whole, when Bill and Scott had been to several investors, weren't getting anywhere. They finally went to J.B. Doherty, a venture capitalist who Also tried a bunch of avenues to bring in financing, also was getting shut out. And then, they kind of got down to the last thing and kind of a throwaway. He said, look, I know somebody at Getty, it's oil. It doesn't seem like a fit, but where it was a fit is that they were used to gambling on oil fields, right? Gambling that it's not going to be a dry hole. Drill and you're going to find something. You might have a dry hole and you lose your money. But they were a bit of gambler, had a little bit of gambler in them too. So that was, JB Doherty and the venture capitalists who came in were critical to that juggle all coming together at the same time too.
All right, Mike, I got one for you in particular. So I know there was, I think, an ESPN 30 for 30 or a short on the first ever live event, right? The American Professional Slow Pitch League Championship Series. Tell me, can you give us a little bit of background as to, like, from what you could tell, how and why that was chosen to be kind of the first official live thing?
Well, we found something out in the process that isn't in the film that I love the detail of. George Grand, who anchored the first Sports Center and was with ESPN for 10 years, his brother, Carl, owned the New England Pilgrims, New Haven-based, of the Slow Pitch Softball League. George had yet to be hired by ESPN, but his brother knew that George knew Bill, and George knew a guy named Lou Palmer, who was a local broadcaster who became on air for ESPN and also a director of programming.
Lou Palmer, please.
Yes. And so Carl Grand pitches ESPN, finds out that he's looking for something to run live on September 7, and that's how the Slow Pitch World Series ends up being the first event. The E60 that was done, Jeremy Schaap, a lot of tongue-in-cheek stuff that, they went to do the story of the first event of ESPN and realized ESPN didn't have the videotape. And then we found out that somebody involved with the Slow Pitch World Series had it sitting in his basement and put it to sale for ESPN. And, they used it for that. We used it for our document, but that video had not existed in the ESPN archives prior to that. And then, the classic thing, the first game on ESPN is, the Kentucky Bourbon against the Milwaukee Schlitzes, sponsored by Anheuser-Busch. And Anheuser-Busch had paid a crazy premium to be exclusive. And the first thing we give them is the Milwaukee Schlitzes, their competitor, to sponsor. So that was how it came to be. That, I believe, that E60 is on YouTube. It definitely is something anyone listening to this would enjoy. It's a fun watch.
And that was a director from Bill, to go along with setting, September 7th, 1979 as the launch date and not coming off of that. He also wanted something, after the very first Sports Center with George Grand, to go to an event that was live. And they didn't have, the NFL or NBA or MLB, the NHL, contract at that time. So all they could find was this softball game. So they live in infamy now, right? A softball game started ESPN, first live event. Slow pitch softball.
Yeah, and look, that, with all due respect, that's a league that we want to go deeper into. We have not been able to find the right hook yet to kind of go deep into that, because it was the team called the Minnesota Goofies, and there's some ex-baseball players and stuff. It was a legit thing in the late 70s, and I think actually, I want to say that Dennis Murphy and some others were involved in that too. So ABA at the beginning of the decade and slow pitch softball at the end of the decade. I mean, the 70s were just an amazing time for that kind of stuff. Speaking of the 70s, though, it was interesting, and I think George mentioned this. I think he was the source of this. And I suspect you guys knew this, but I don't think most ESPN fans know this. I think the mythology is that September 7th, 1979 was not only the day that ESPN started, but that it was 24/7 from that moment on. Mm-hmm. And George kind of, I think, reveals that the 24-hour thing didn't really kick in until maybe a year later. Do I have that right?
Yeah, the marketing of it was, 24-hour weekend, and whatever time events were over and the Sports Center was over, that they'd go off on a weekday and sign off and come back the next day. And they expanded that a little over that course of the year. But yeah, it wasn't until I believe it was September 1 of 1980 that it was fulfilled. They promised all along it would be 24 hours a day. And they just said, we need to get there. Take some time in building this up. And they kept, and then announced a date that they would do that and fulfilled the date and stayed 24 hours a day from that point forward.
And to do that, now you get to see darts and skiing and also, Aussie rules football and anything that they could find to fill the time.
Yeah, I was going to say probably that part of that was semi-genius in that they wanted to be able to find stuff, right? And you couldn't necessarily find all of it and stuff. And that NCAA deal, clearly, I mean, I remember vividly as a kid in the very early 1980s hearing of ESPN broadcasting these games in the NCAA basketball tournament. And it's the only place to get them. And it's like, I was always, some kids would be arguing to get cable, right, for the MTV thing, right? But for me, it was like the sports thing is happening and we don't have it. And I'm dying here. I'm interested in the media industry here. I'd love to watch these games. But it really does seem that NCAA relationship / contract or adjunct to that programming, right? Which was, again, in the late 1970s, early 80s, cable was very early on, not many chances to watch it aside from network TV and or a couple of independent stations, depending on the market you're in.
Right.
I wouldn't call it happenstance because it seemed like Bill knew what he was doing, but did they really know how important that stuff would be for them programming wise?
I think they knew that there would be interest in the basketball. I think they knew that they needed quantity. Another serendipity kind of moment that helped them a great deal is so the original idea to do UConn sports in Connecticut. Well, the athletic director at the time was a guy named John Toner. And we get into this in the book more than the film, but he was they had this, you kept going up the ranks in the NCAA with athletic directors, and John Toner was going to be the incoming president of the NCAA. At the same time, Bill Rasmussen is talking to him about ESPN in the state of Connecticut. And then when he presents to him that we're going to go national, John Toner opens the doors to Bill to all the key players at the NCAA. And that, NCAA was historically known for moving slowly, but Bill having the endorsement of John Toner opened the doors to the TV committee and opened the doors to Walter Byers and others. And I don't believe that all happens without the serendipity part of him having the relationship with the athletic director at UConn.
And I'll say, Tim, like when Bill does get to Walter Byers, he tells Walter Byers, that you have this tournament that goes on every year, this basketball tournament. We want to cover, and at the time, it was usually the championship game, maybe the Final Four and some regional things a little bit early on that were covered around the country. But it was all those early games that never got any coverage, the first round, the second round. And when Bill said, we're going to cover all of those games, all of them. And, Walter Byers basically said, really? Are you crazy? And Bill said, nope, we want it. And that's what turned into March Madness. Bill created, unknowingly, this juggernaut called March Madness.
Insane, amazingly insane. And, I love the fact, though, that one last thing I'll sort of throw out there. I love the fact that you were able to have Bill as kind of a semi-narration, or at least a point along the curve here in this documentary, because I think having his voice in all of this, and boy, he seems like he remembers things like they were yesterday. It just adds such an element of not only credibility, right, but also just genuineness and heartfeltness, I guess, of this thing that he literally birthed, with a little bit of luck and some and a rabbit's foot of scratch, brought into the world. And I just, the fact that you're sort of able to kind of connote some of these innovations and where they've gone. I mean, in many respects, it wasn't just the birth of a cable network and sports, but also all these little pieces that also got their start along the way.
Yeah. And, look, we talk about Bill, but, if it wasn't for Scott, he was doing a lot of the heavy lifting also, especially with Getty. He's a 22-year-old kid. and he gets thrown into this. And, he's flying back and forth from, Connecticut to LA constantly, working with Stu Evie to try to get the deal across the line. So it was really important to us that Scott got his due for everything that he did also. He's certainly, the unsung hero. I guess he's kind of Robin to Bill's Batman in a way, but without him, it doesn't work either.
That's a great way to put it, for sure. All right. This has been amazing, guys. Let me just add a couple little bits here, and then I'll let you guys unabashedly promote. Of course, we'll promote the heck out of this. I think we're going to drop this. People will be hearing this the Monday that the show debuts on ESPN, the mothership, and the app, and all that stuff. I guess one last sort of thing I'll ask you about. Again, another little nugget at the end that I just couldn't help but see. From your perspective, you basically say that nobody really knows how many people watched that first night. Are there any educated guesses out there? Anybody from the cable space, or numbers of like how many subscribers there were to cable and how many systems had ESPN that first night and stuff? Even raw or rough guesses? Or is it truly an unknown?
I'd say it's truly an unknown. Bill did some demonstration events starting in November of '78 to provide the cable operators a chance to download the signal and build some credibility that, that they were going to deliver what they said they were going to deliver. And had a lot of cable systems that had an interest. They weren't needing programming at the time. Some didn't start on September 7th. Some waited till October or December of the next year. There wasn't any kind of Nielsen numbers or what have you. Greg charged me with finding someone who watched the first night at home, and I was able to do that. He's unfortunately not in the film, but he is in the book and tells his story of how that happened to be. But after being here 48 years, I know of people that watched it in the control room and at the watch party, and Bob Lee at his cable system in New Jersey, but I only know one who credibly watched it the night of the launch. Usually I would hear the stories of the first night viewer and they'd say, oh yeah, Chris Berman did this, or Bob Lee did that. And it's like, no, they weren't working there then. Or Dick Vitale did this, or you showed Australian rules football. Or I'd hear all these things and I just shake my head, yes, but they all were not true. So it was a very small audience.
Do you even know how many cable operators picked it up from the beginning?
No, I think I remember seeing the figure that it was available to, like, I saw 3 million homes and then I saw 10 million homes. I don't really know.
Okay, I won't then press you on where the jingle came from.
The jingle on the first show? I actually had a conversation on this with Bill, who then sent me to Greg Wyatt, who's in the film. Greg was an early SportsCenter anchor who we interviewed and gave us good stuff. But the key with Greg was he became the first LA-based person for SportsCenter and sat down the hall at Getty Oil's building from Stu Evie. So he had that perspective as well. But Greg had come from a television station in San Diego and knew the general manager, who had a friend who had a jingle house, that did like ad jingles. And that's the story that Bill and then Greg Wyatt told me on. That's how that song came to be.
Yeah.
Go
ahead.
I'm sorry, Tim, go ahead.
No, please.
Well, I was going to say, it's like the logo. Their very first logo, when it was called ESP, was designed by the printer they took it to. They were like, they got to the printer. They had kind of devised their own little thing, and they got to the printer and he said, let me fix this up a little bit for you. And that was the original logo that we don't really see much anymore. It changed, but they were going just flying by the seat of their pants. Whoever will create a jingle for them, whoever will give them they didn't have a lot of money at that point, but they wanted to have an identity. The jingle obviously came later. But, it was put together with, spit and dirt, whatever it took.
And that made a lot of mud, it seemed like, too, at the very beginning, for sure.
Indeed.
All right. So I guess the sort of last thing I'll ask both of you here is any parts of this story that eluded you that were never sort of either answered in your mind and do you think separately, do you think there are other ESPN historical stories to similarly pursue down the road should you have the finances and the means to do so?
I'll take the second part, Mike. Yes, I mean, ultimately, I'd love to do the entire history up to the 50th anniversary coming up. I would love to do something like that. There's a lot there, no doubt about it. It would, each little, kind of block of time, whether it's, presidents or decades, brings their own dramas and their own great characters, their own conflict. So, that would be something on the top of my list, certainly.
Yeah, I think there's an endless amount of stories, and you look, they did a 30 for 30 on Stuart Scott, and that was very successful. They're working on a doc on the 40 years of NFL primetime, and that the impact that has had on NFL fandom, on highlight airing, on a number of angles, and that should be good. I think there's just a lot of stories to be told, and as time goes on, that they become historical in nature because they're so far back in time.
You promise you'll come back on the show and talk about them when they come to fruition?
Sure.
Absolutely. It's been fun, Tim.
All right. Mighty thanks to Mike and Greg. Fantastic exploration of an amazing story, and you could hear it in their voices, the passion, the level of detail, the labor of loveness around this film, which, if you are listening to this episode as we drop it on the 6th of April 2026, this evening will be making its debut on ESPN television, the mothership of all things ESPN. It is called, again, Sports Heaven, The Birth of ESPN. It will be on this evening, April 6th, 2026, at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time. So make sure you're either home or got your DVR set up or your recording device or whatever to ensure that you snag this great documentary, Sports Heaven, The Birth of ESPN. Now, if you are listening to this episode after that period of time, after that show drops, after the 6th of April, let's say, we do not yet know, as we record this, when that film will be either rebroadcast or available elsewhere. But you can check this website. This is the production house's website. It's Tenero.tv. Tenero is T as in Tom, E-N as in Nancy, E-R-O, Tenero.tv. And depending when you're listening to this show, you can find out just exactly where you can access this film. Now, also, there is going to be a book that complements this film that will include a whole bunch more of stuff that never did make the film for whatever reasons. That book is published by Hachette, and it will be out sometime in May. Not yet available. And as soon as we know and when that's going to be available, we will let you know as well. But what is available right now as we drop this episode, regardless of when you're listening, is the audiobook. Yes, the audiobook is available before the printed book. Who knew you could do such a thing? It is called the same, Sports Heaven, The Birth of ESPN. And it is 7 hours of audio goodness of this story, which is unabridged and contains little extras along the way, including not only narration of the book, but also actual audio of the majority of folks that were in the film itself. So you'll hear Bob Lee, you'll hear Chris Berman, you'll hear the Rasmussen, Scott and Bill, you'll hear George Grant, you'll hear Jimmy Pitaro, you'll hear all these voices, Chuck Pagano, all of them, Howard Baldwin, former guest on this show, et cetera, in the mixture of the telling of this story. So if you've never tried an audiobook, this is a great excuse to try. And if you go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com, search up this episode numbered 440, you'll find a convenient link to the audiobook from our friends at Amazon. We'll get some shekels of referral love. And again, depending on when you're listening to this, we'll also have links to the physical book for your purchase consideration, as well as to the film in whatever forms or fashions it might be available as well. Of course, we will put those links in the show description. So if you don't feel like you want to go on the web, well, you'll find those links in the show description right there. So you really have no excuse not to find some version of this story to further your knowledge and appreciation for this great network that we've grown to love over the many, many years, ESPN. And my thanks again to Mike and Greg for sharing the entire story of putting this story together. We appreciate it to no end. Okay, well, you know our website, goodseatsstillavailable.com. Not only do we post all of our episodes there, but we also have merch there for you and other goodies. So feel free to bookmark that and visit early and often. There's a search bar up there. You can kind of search all the different stories and topics and stuff. Have at it. Our email address is hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. And be sure to follow us on the various socials. You'll find us on the X thing at Good Seats Still. You will find us on the Blue Sky thing at goodseatsstillavailable.com. And you will find us just about everywhere else at Good Seats Still Available, all one word, including YouTube, where we publish all of these episodes and stream them for you as well. So if you can't figure out the podcast thing, you can always go to the YouTube thing there and just get the goodness each and every week for you there as well. Oh, by the way, when you're online or in the socials, you want to follow Mike. Mike Soltys's X handle is at Michael J, the letter J, Soltys, Soltys, at Michael J. Soltys. All right, I am done for this week. I hope you enjoyed this film. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. And I look forward to sharing more goodness coming your way in the weeks to come. Stay tuned to your feeds. I appreciate you listening for sure. See ya.